Welcome GRD131, Graphic Design 1. This is your old pal, Professor Homa, talking to you about what not to do with fonts. It's kind of a public service message, but these are good rules to follow, and you'll see videos that go over this stuff, but I have a PDF here that I used to use in courses in the past, and since we're talking about typography, and since we're talking about design principles, and we're going to be doing some logo design, I want to talk to you about what not to do with fonts, how not to use fonts together, because you're not always just going to use one font together, one font family, even though you can. You're going to be mixing fonts occasionally. That creates variety. It creates contrast, and we want to do that. But I just want to show you some things not to do and things that you should do. So actually, we start off here in always. So we always want to contrast and complement. I don't have the word complement there, but there's like 4 C's. We want to complement and we want to contrast. That's what's going to work best when we're using fonts from different categories. And when I'm talking about different categories, I mean a script and a sans serif. I mean a serif and a sans serif. I mean a decorative and a sans serif. We want to make sure whenever we're combining fonts, they're from different categories. Either they're from the same family, that we have like a heavy version and a light version, or they're from different categories, because then there'll be higher contrast. We don't want to use like a Garamond and a Crimson Pro, or a Libre Franklin and an Archivo. We don't want to use 2 sans serifs. We don't want to use 2 scripts. We don't want to use any of that together. So this handout just shows you some of that, and I'll have it posted under Unit 7 as a PDF file just to look at. It doesn't have a whole lot of information, but it's just a quick guide, and I just use this Bailey's Cafe. I used to use this in the past because I had a dog named Bailey. But what's being used here in this one, the first one in the upper left, is a heavy sans serif font with a light script. Does that work? Yeah, it works. That's not the greatest logo. We don't have a lot of alignment. I can move Cafe around if I wanted to. Maybe there's a better way to do that to create some flow. But just as a centered logo, they work together. That's a good combination. I don't know if that's the perfect combination that I'm showing right there. And here's another one down here that actually works. Here's a heavy sans serif, and it's a light italic. Does that work? Well, it's very similar. Scripts and italics are sometimes similar, so that works. We have contrast with this type category, with that category. We have contrast in size. We have contrast in this being heavy and that being light. So that's what you want. You want one to complement the other. So sometimes a script font will complement the other one. If you have a big, heavy, masculine-looking font, sometimes a feminine font with it or a softer font will kind of complement it, accent it, so they're not competing against each other. You don't want to have 2 big, similar fonts competing with each other. So we always want to contrast and complement. So they kind of do that. It's not the perfect example, but I think you know what I'm talking about here. Same thing over here. We have Bailey's now in a script, and we have a light sans serif under here. Now, I'm not crazy about this combination, but it actually works as a combination. This doesn't break the rules. This follows the rules. But using something like this script font here, it's thicker, and this is lighter, so we have contrast. And do they complement each other? They might. I don't know. Again, looking at this is an older thing that I worked on, but I would put Cafe somewhere else. But yeah, this works. This is acceptable combination. Is it the best? No, but it's acceptable. Same thing here. Now we have a heavy serif italic. So it's a bold serif italic. It looks like it could be a Garamond. And we have a light sans serif underneath. And actually, one of the reasons I don't like the sans serif, because it's more of a geometric style, meaning it has very round letter forms, which make it more distinctive, which doesn't make it complement the other font as nice. I mean, does it break the rules? No. It follows the rules, so these follow the rules. Maybe I have to make another flyer when I do this, but it doesn't break the rules. So these are contrasting, and they're using fonts from different categories. So what you want to avoid, this is more the important thing here, you don't want to use 2 from the same category. You don't want to use 2 scripts together because they compete. If they have similar kind of characteristics, they're going to compete with each other. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to have 2 decorative fonts together because they're both kind of clamoring for attention. Because what happens is they compete and they conflict. So you don't want to compete and conflict. You want to contrast and complement. So these are competing and conflicting. And, they're both heavy too, so that makes them conflict and compete a little bit more if you have bold fonts. Same thing down here. These are 2 different sans serif fonts. This is, I'm not even sure what this is. This is one of those geometric ones again, but there's another type there. You can see the A is a little bit different. It's a little different styled. This has that E with the line going up. So it's a little bit different style. I think Gill Sans, I think, is the one I was thinking for there. But these just don't work together because they compete a little bit. The styles and weight are similar. Nothing really stands out. We don't have contrast. We don't have complementing going on. We have a little bit of conflicting going on, a little bit of competing. Same thing down here. Here's two separate serif fonts. This looks like a Garamond type font, kind of a regular weight, maybe a semi-bold or something. And then we have another type of almost decorative serif font down here. I'll zoom in here. Very sharp kind of serifs on it. So it's definitely a different serif font. And again, I can't think of the name of it immediately, but it's a fairly common serif font. But it's decorative in terms of a serif font. It's not something that you would use for a lot of body copy. So it doesn't work well together. They conflict. They compete. So you don't want that. You don't want to compete. You don't want to conflict. And these are examples of competing and conflicting. These are examples of contrasting and complementing. For the most part, I'll probably bring out different examples for you, better examples than these. And then at the bottom, a couple things just to note, and we talked about this already, but especially with script, don't ever use script in all caps. I mean, there may be somewhere, again, there may be a rule you could break occasionally, but because scripts typically have very decorative capital letters, they don't work well in caps. They're not readable at all. So you don't want to do anything like this. And I've seen logos like this. I've seen Italian restaurants and pizza places have brush script in all caps. And it looks terrible and it looks unprofessional. You don't want to do that because script fonts are not meant to be used in all caps. That's why they have the connecting lowercase letters. These don't connect. So they don't go together. They're very disconnected and disjointed and they're hard to read. And they become illegible. So you don't want that. And down here, also another little thing, Shift Option bracket, and I'll have to get you the Windows version. This is the difference between a curly quote and a straight quote. Straight quotes are great for coding and programming and things like that, but they don't always look good, especially with a script font here. You want to use the curly quote, and I'll show you different ways to do that. I think in Gravit it's going to be a little bit different to do that. Some programs will do that automatically, will automatically put in a curly quote, but just be aware of those, because I've seen logos too where people have a real nice looking logo and then have a straight quote in there, and it looks terrible. You don't want a generic quote. That's the kind of quote you'd use for like inches and feet. This is the kind of quote you want to use for contractions or possessives and things like that. So that's for inches and feet. This is kind of quotes. And that goes for double quotes and single quotes and things like that. So be aware of that. And I even have some reading about that, which I'm sure you'll love to read read about quotes. And again, I think I've shown this before, but putting all caps is usually not readable. In certain circumstances, you can have a headline and it says stop, or it's very noticeable and you can have something in all caps, but usually all caps is hard to read, especially in a serif font down here. It's just really hard to read. If this was an upper and lowercase, it would be a lot easier to read. And we'll talk more about this, but this is a nice little sheet that just goes over a couple of these. Like I said, it's older. I've had this for years, and some of these logos could probably be improved a little bit to give you better examples. I'll put a different dog name or something, but just a couple things to remember. Always kind of contrast with different type categories. You don't want to put the same type categories together. Always try to contrast with size, with weight, and like I said, different categories. So pull one from one category and one from another. It doesn't mean that that'll always work. It doesn't mean you could use a decorative and a script together, because sometimes they can be used interchangeably. So you'll have to be careful with that, but just some rules to follow. Don't mix type from the same category. And down here, this is kind of examples of doing that, which there's always kind of, sometimes it's a glaring kind of noticeable thing. Sometimes it's just something that just doesn't feel right. So always remember, contrast, complement, and avoid competing and conflicting, and just a couple things down here to avoid as well. So I just wanted to give you that little public service announcement for fonts. So don't abuse fonts. Don't do things like that with fonts. Try to follow the rules as best you can, and I'll have more reminders as the semester goes on.